What's up, brother? It's your boy Mike Muse. Another conversation on the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be in conversation with my next guest. He has made this incredible film, Leonardo da Vinci, and I couldn't be more excited to speak with him. Leonardo da Vinci is an artist that I love to admire. I love any artist that is a polymath. As you know, I'm obsessed with all things math, science, technology, engineering, and art. Audience, as you know, I started my own record label about being an engineer and being a nuclear physicist at the same time. And so I understand right brain and left brain. Also, too, having those both sides can really create dynamic moments and mediums. And I think there's no better person to do that than Leonardo. While I've had the chance to travel the world and be up close and personal with Leonardo's works, both in the Louvre and at the Vatican Museum, I have been wildly impressed with the science actually behind the art. And so I'm so thankful that this incredible historian and documentarian, Ken Burns, had decided to join us today and unpack his film. Ken, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be on. Honored to be on.
Well, what was your muse for actually wanting to do Leonardo da Vinci this film? What was a particular work that gravitated towards you? Talk to me, because I have a Mayan person that really gravitated, made me want to learn more about him, but I
Well,
want to
I'll
hear
tell
from
you,
you though.
I was dragged kicking and screaming to this, and I'm glad I was. I was working on a film on Benjamin Franklin. All my topics have been in American history, and I was with the great biographer Walter Isaacson, a friend, and he was pushing not only Franklin, which we were working on. He gave us a good interview for that. But he had made a biography that I didn't know about on Leonardo, and he kept pushing that. I kept saying, I don't do non-American stuff. And I came out, and the my two co-directors and the writers of this program, along with one on Muhammad Ali and Jackie Robinson and the Central Park Five, are my oldest daughter, Sarah Burns, and her husband, David McMahon. We've been working together for 15 years. And when I mentioned this, they said, "Oh, let's do it." And I suddenly realized this old dog could be taught new tricks. And that's really what this is. This is an amazing story. I mean, polymath doesn't go far enough. Genius doesn't go far enough. Maybe the person of the last millennium, I mean, obviously Shakespeare or Mozart or Bach could give him the run for the money, but this is the greatest painter of the age, if not of all time. He's painted the greatest painting of all time, so certainly the most well-known painting of all time. He painted fewer than 20 of them. Half of those were not finished, but he also happens to be the greatest philosopher, the greatest scientist, the greatest anatomist, the greatest botanist. He studies the flight of birds. He understands gravity before Galileo. He's working in principles without a microscope or a telescope that are dissecting nature and understanding the microcosm and the macrocosm that are only recent things. He designed a heart, a working model of a heart that had
Mhm.
no purposes when he was living, none whatsoever. Nobody was even doing surgery on the heart. No one had even thought that you could. But he designed something that 450 years later, only MRI showed us that he was exactly right about how the valves worked, that there were four chambers, not two, as was popularly thought at the time. I got a foot doctor in New York who says he only studies Leonardo's drawings of the human anatomy with regard to feet. He's just, you cannot say enough. And so what happens is he's putting all this knowledge of science into the art. So the
Yeah.
first time ever in painting, people are not just looking like they're real three-dimensionally. He wants to know what the intentions of their mind are. He wants to know what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And so there's a kind of movement and dynamics, but also this deep spiritual resonance to it. And so in some ways, as a critic at the time said, I can see it in her face, the Mona Lisa's face, but I drop down to her neck and I can see her heart beating, which means
Mhm.
he's a god. He has taken inanimate objects and breathed them to life. And I think that is, it means that Mona Lisa is a great work of science and the anatomies are great works of art. And he would be frustrated with me for having to make the distinctions. There's just
I
been
think
no
there's
one
something
like him.
interesting around like this intersectionality of science and art, in particular when it comes to religion. There is a famous poet by the name of Jay-Z who makes a song, "No Church in the Wild," and then that line have always resonated with me. He says, question religion, question everything. And I've always thought that when I've questioned my faith, I grew up very religious. That's why I grew up watching the Last Supper hang in my church every Sunday from a kid into adulthood. And when you grow up and you begin to question religion, you actually, for me, it actually made my faith that much stronger.
Exactly.
But there always like is this oil and vinegar that church and religion and science just don't commingle. But I think there is this beautiful intersectionality between it. And when you really look at the spiritual dynamics of Leonardo from the Last Supper, but also too Saint Jerome in the wilderness, right? There
Exactly.
is
Unbelievable. Unfinished painting.
this examination of that. Talk to me a little bit about how that resonates and jumps out about like this intersectionality and this symbiotic relationship that I think really makes his artwork just so poignant.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head that we tend to be taught in binary systems, and he doesn't see things in that way. He's not saying, "Oh, I'm a scientist today and I'm an artist today." He's all these things, and in order to be a good artist, he has to be a great scientist. In order to be a good scientist, he has to be a great artist, and he is all those things. So that, the opposite for you, the opposite of faith is not doubt, as we've been told. In fact, doubt is central and healthy to faith. The opposite of faith is certainty, which denudes anything of the possibility of mystery, which is what we're all sort of seeking, is this unknown thing. And so with Leonardo, the intersectionality is never greater, never more central to the question, because he's taking these scenes like say the Virgin and the Rocks, classical scene of
Mm.
the Madonna and child. There's a
Yeah,
baby, John the Baptist, who's reaching out. Mary's trying to restrain John the Baptist, but her son, infant Jesus, is blessing John the Baptist. And she, with her other hand, is trying to reach down to get him. But there's an angel in the way because even though she's known through all time, she is bound to bear the Son of God and that he is due for the passion, her own motherly instincts at the same time are going on. So you have this, classical scene of medieval and Renaissance art that everybody paints. Everybody
yeah,
paints. And nobody painted it that way. And nobody painted the Last Supper as I think, Mike, it's the first piece of film. It's not a
it
frozen
is.
moment. It's got 8 or 10 seconds of movement in it that you can see. And he does that with the Mona
But that's
Lisa.
also too when you think about like some of the pieces are in the Vatican, you also think about like the Pope and the papacy. There's always like this deity that is assigned to the Pope in terms of their conclave and how they select and the smoke and all the things, not
Right.
into the pomp and circumstance. But there is something really interesting about the way that that Pope dynamic is handled. Even if you look at most recently with the coronation of the King Charles, the moment we haven't seen that ancient rhythm and that ancient tradition in so long. But there he goes, he sits into this throne, they put the shield around him, and that's when God is supposed to come down and ordain him this godliness of it. And it's so coveted that you can't see it. That's the screens of it. But there's always this mysticalness that's
Right.
associated to certain religious kind of doctrination aspect of it. And so that the Virgin Mary, when it comes to that, I've always grown up though in a religious Baptist sense, is that although the preacher is the head of the church that you're attending, they still are man, right? And that they are human, right? And so there's always, I felt like this push-pull in religion
Yeah.
from creating this clergy to remain like this deity, this mythical, angelical dynamic, while still looking at them as man. And I think that is what was so unique about the Virgin Mary is that although there is this passion, there is this moment of reverence and service and this act that's supposed to happen, but you can't take away the carnal flesh
That's right
that
there.
it is a mother, which is just human.
And this is what Leonardo has done all his life. He's born out of wedlock, so it makes it impossible for him to go to university. So his first school is nature, and he always has understood nature's perfection in the face of our human imperfection. And so he's always looking at that and always seeing it as his judge. And so even though he doesn't go to university, he knows more than any scholar in any field about their field. And he
Mhm.
is more than that. I mean, when the French king Francis I imports him from Italy to be his Aristotle to what Francis I thinks is his Alexander, you know, it's a nice analogy, but Aristotle was a philosopher and a thinker and a writer, and Leonardo is that. And oh, by the way, the greatest painter of his age, if not of all time. He's also the greatest scientist of his time, without a doubt. And he's all these other things. And so, in a way, what he does is the Renaissance is really the recentering of human beings within the dynamic of this spiritual story in which it has
Hmm.
always been cloistered. It's always mystery. Leonardo is this funny person. He plays music, he sings, he puts on pageants. There's a kind of, he intercedes on behalf of humanity and says, we've got a voice here. We are who we are, and that these paintings can live and breathe and not be these two-dimensional, flat, iconic things where all women always look to the side. He has women looking at you, not just the Mona Lisa,
Yeah.
the epitome of this, but Ginevra da Benci
But
and
David Da Vinci.
with the
But isn't though the idea
ermine
that you
and all of
find
that.
you mentioned nature, but isn't that true about you find God actually in nature? Like
This is
when you remove all the dogma of it, right? Like you always
well,
find
this
God
is
in nature. If you think
well,
about
this
the
is
monarch butterfly, right? The monarch butterfly has this way of doing the metamorphosis as a single entity, a single being, but
right.
on cue, it knows when to go in, when to cocoon, when to shed, how to hang, let gravity hang itself, how to let his wings dry out, and then fly in his migration pattern.
Yeah, well, what you're talking about is an American gospel. This is why Leonardo is so modern. Of all the characters I've studied, though he's the oldest, he died more than 500 years ago, he'd fit right in. And it was our American catechism. It was Emerson saying that you could find God less in cathedrals built by man than out in in this world that God created. And of course, the question for the monarch is, does the cocoon know what it's going to become? Does the pupa
Mhm.
understand that it's going to be a monarch? And our human possibilities are much greater than that because we have been blessed with the gift of consciousness and we don't use that much of it. Like people say
Mhm.
we use 10% of our brain. If that's the case, it's a cliche, I don't know. Leonardo's using 75 or 85% of the brain. And don't you want to know about that? Don't you
Right.
want more of it?
You mentioned American gospel. I'm curious, just to know your thoughts, Ken. Do you think that Leonardo, in his own way, was examining the relationship of dogma, examining the relationship with the monarchy system and the kings? Because back then, one could argue was form for connection with God from the spiritual dynamic, or was it control over society?
Well, it's obviously
I think
all the
about my visits to the Vatican Museum, and I think about how many pieces were commissioned
right.
for the Pope, which was damn near a king, in that mindset, right?
Oh,
And so, do
most
you think
definitely.
he's examining this
I
music
think these
museum?
are accidents of fortuitousness. We are blessed with the gift of the life of Leonardo, who saw more, and he was lucky to have been, because he was born out of wedlock. He is not privileged to have the kind of enforcement of dogma on him at every step of the way, and so there's a kind of freedom. He's actually named, can't be named for any of the family names of his father, so he's named after a patron saint of freedom called Leonardo, and he kind of embodies that and steps out of it. And no one had seen anything like this before. The most important thing, when you realize how few pieces of art there are and how half of them aren't even finished,
Right.
still left us 6,000, 4 to 6,000 pages of notebooks and drawings and philosophies on painting, on water
Mhm.
dynamics, on air, on atmosphere, on rocks, on fossils, on the flight of birds, on all of these different subjects, anatomy, beautiful, beautiful things. And none of them are published in his lifetime. So what happens is over the
But isn't that art
interceding
though unto itself?
500
Though
years,
I'm gonna stop you right there for a second, Ken. That's art unto itself, right? You have
oh
this.
yeah.
There is a genre of concept art, right, where oftentimes it's just the instructions for the patron of who purchased this conceptual art piece to then go out and hang it, design it, set up the room according to the instructions. Sometimes the art itself is just the
Well,
instructions.
for him, I think he abandons these works because he's not going to play into what you were talking about, the patron system, the commission system.
Hmm.
He's going to do it, and if he finishes it, he finishes it. He finished The Last Supper, and mainly
Right.
because it's the Duke of Milan, Levica Sforza, who
Hmm.
might, cut off his head if he doesn't finish it on time. But other stuff he abandons because I think the questions that he's asking himself have been answered, or he realizes that this set of circumstances can't answer it. Or
But
take
I'm saying,
the portrait
for me,
of
the
this
unfinished.
24-year-old
Yeah.
Florentine merchant, his wife Lisa, who's 24 years old, has 5 kids. He's commissioned to do a painting. He never delivers it, but that's called
Mhm.
the Mona Lisa. He's always
But
working on it.
But even in the unfinished, that's the point I was getting at. Not so much about the commissioning aspect of it, but sometimes the unfinished is art unto itself, right? Like
Exactly.
sometimes art doesn't always have to be complete. Like the
That's
number one
right.
question you ask to an artist at contemporary times is like, when do you know the art is finished, right? And
He
most of
says
them don't
this
really
to
have that
himself,
answer to
D,
that.
D me, D
Hmm.
me, D me, tell me,
Yeah.
when is it ever finished? And he
Hmm.
abandons his most spectacular work called the Adoration of the Magi.
Yeah.
It's considered the first experimental painting because he's changing things as he's going along, and then he stops. He's put himself in the lower right-hand corner, who's the only figure looking
Yeah.
away from this amazing thing. And you
Yeah.
think it's sort of like, oh, I think I got all that I'm going to get out of this. I'm out of
Yeah.
here to the next thing. So you're absolutely right. The adoration is in itself an extraordinary work of art, and it's
Hmm.
incomplete. And then if you think of the drawings as just, works in process, just the thought processes, you're dealing with just, I can't think of anybody who's on the level of Leonardo, period. And it's
What was
helpful
the
to us
role
because
of the
he feels
Medici
modern.
family and the patron world?
Well, they were in the early days of Florence, where it fancied itself a kind of democracy because the guilds were the ones that created the ruling body, the Signoria. It were the wealthy families behind it. The most wealthiest were the Medicis who commissioned various things. Most of his stuff went from other places, and he actually chafed in Florence after a while and went to Milan, which was strange because it was ruled by a despot, but it was there that he was able to do the Last Supper, design elaborate pageants. He had a big,
Hmm.
gigantic horse that was going to be cast in bronze, and then all of a sudden a war came up, and Sforza, the Duke, confiscated all
But
the brass and took it away.
yeah. But Ken, isn't it interesting a push-pull relationship that you see artists they have with their patrons back during this time period, all the way to the push-pull dynamic of artists and what they have in the patrons now? Oftentimes, we as a society in modern times can critique those upper society, the one percenters, but one could say the upper society one percenters are the patrons and custodians of art and culture holds it, so that most of the time art can remain free in some cases in terms
Some
of to
cases,
be
one aspect
viewed,
of it free.
right? In terms of like when I think about museums, public museums, right? And that dynamic has always been this push-pull dynamic and fraught relationship I felt that artists have had
Well,
with patrons.
I'm in public broadcasting, and we depend not on investors. We
Yep.
depend on corporate underwriting, the Bank of America, foundations like the
Hmm.
Arthur Vining Davis foundations, but also
Family
individuals of
foundations.
wealth,
Hmm.
that one
Hmm.
percenter who provide with no piece in it. It's like you do what you want to do, and it's the closest we come to that sort of situation. The difference here is that I can never not finish something, right? They all get done, and also there's a church and state dividing line. Nobody can come in and say, oh, you've got to make it longer or shorter or sexy or less, more less sexy or more violent or less violent, whatever it is. We make the films we want to do, and I feel privileged not only to be able to complete them, but to have the total freedom. So every one of our films, because of public broadcasting, is a director's cut. And if you don't like it, another way to put it, it's all our fault. I have no suit to blame this on. Nobody who came in who gave me notes that I didn't follow, or made me follow that made the film lesser. It's just whatever we've done collectively. In this case, Sarah Burns and David McMahon and myself.
Yeah. What was your painting that hooked you into Leonardo? What was it?
I think it was I'd seen the Mona Lisa many times and hadn't really gotten it. It's busy, lots of people in the way. It seems smaller. You don't. What's the big fuss? There's got to be some other reason. There's a joke, about it. Everybody can, talks about the smile. And I hope one of the byproducts of this film is no one makes a joke about the smile anymore, because you will understand that in that smile is the entire human project, all the spiritual dimensions, all the physical dimensions, all the failings, all the possibilities, all the good stuff. I think it was Virgin of the Rocks that finally made me sit up straight and to see that at the same time that Mary could be going along with this whole eternal project of bear the Son of God who will ultimately die for our sins. She is also a mother with the maternal instincts. And the fact that somebody could, in one painting, contain both those things in a time when people didn't even think that you could have a contradictory undertow in a painting. And he does it with a naturalism that she feels like a real person. You feel like you understand, as he keeps saying, the intentions of her mind.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of Leonardo's work. This is one of those true cases where beauty in the eye of the beholder, but also too is it's also into the beauty is in the eye of how you discover the work in the piece,
That's
right? For
right.
me, obviously, I can point to. I think there's something haunting and absolutely beautiful about Saint Jerome in the Wilderness.
I knew you were going to say that. St. Jerome has got
It's very stirring for me. It's
Yeah,
very
and he
sim.
worked
It's
on it for
yeah.
years and years and years and
Hmm.
years and was always adjusting as he learned more about from dissections, learned more
Yeah.
about human musculature. As you know, that whole
Yeah.
neck and
The
shoulder
neck
area
thing,
is
the way he's
raw.
turned.
Oh
Yeah,
my goodness. And here we
yeah,
have him just comes down to us as this penitent, I think 6th century penitent. And so it's all about suffering, but he turns it into something much more glorious and turns the
yeah,
tables on the ordinary, which is what our whole project
hmm
is to
yeah.
turn the tables on the ordinary.
But that's the human experience, right? It's just
Yeah.
like sometimes there is finding like pain in this, beauty in the suffering, right? Which
Yeah.
is such a contradictory statement, right?
No, no,
And it's and
no.
it's and
But
so it's
all
such
of
an
us are like
irony
that.
about it. But
You and
like
I
this,
are defined more
yeah,
by their struggles than
yeah,
we are by the good times. And everybody wants
yeah,
to spend their time finding the good times, living in those gated communities as if
hmm
the inevitable vicissitudes of life won't visit us. They will. And
yeah,
we're going to have to fall back on resources. And it's good to have somebody who's the sum of the whole is so much greater than the sum of the parts. And that
yeah.
the human question is always, what's that difference? And
And
Leonardo
for
is asking that all the time.
all the time, and definitely as we wrap, but I think that there's something about a turn that I had as on my most recent visit to the Mona Lisa. Because probably like you, I was always trying to figure out what is the big deal about this, right? Like, what is this obsession, right? In America, for those of us who haven't seen it's a very small painting, right? It isn't like this massive and gigantic thing. It's very demure, to use the word of the season right now, right? And I was like, what is the obsession with it? And I thought it was the eyes that was following, right? And the way that I thought, but I think that's the science of Leonardo da Vinci, right? How he studied that. But also, too, then it was the smile, and to your point, all of humanity. But then I've come to recently have become obsessed with that. People are obsessed with it because of the story of how it was lost and then how it was found and how it was returned, right? And so then I was like, oh, that has a new dynamic that has
Yep.
nothing to do with the
Everything,
painting
it's
unto
another
itself.
layer on it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.